Good afternoon, everyone. We're now in the second half. We had a great halftime show. And thank you again for joining us for this third panel. So first I will introduce our speakers, and it's really quite exciting and an honor. Going alphabetically, sitting next to me, Maya Arad, who is an Israeli author living in America, living in California, but currently in New York. Maya has published 12 books of fiction in Hebrew, and also, because she holds a PhD in linguistics, has published studies in literary criticism and linguistics. And as they used to say when I was in Boston, living in Boston during college, she's wicked smart. So she really has quite a range. You can read in the pamphlet where her credentials are from. It is very worth mentioning that that her latest two books of Hebrew fiction are the first two of hers to be translated into English by the celebrated translator Jessica Cohen, and most recently she published an excellent new book called Happy New Year's, which we will talk about a lot more. Sitting next to Maya, we have Ruby Namdar, who is also an Israeli writer of fiction living in New York. And Ruby was born and raised in Jerusalem, and his family is Persian Jews, and he won the Sapir Prize, which is Israel's highest, most prestigious literary award. And as we'll discuss, as a teacher, Ruby also focuses on Talmud and biblical and Talmudic narrative. And finally, at the end, we have Josh Leifer, who is an American living in Israel. So we're mixing things up a little bit, and maybe also Israeli, but Josh is a columnist for Haaretz, and he is also the author of an award-winning book that I have right here we'll talk about, called Tablets Shattered, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life, rather appropriate for our purposes. And he is also, while living in Tel Aviv, getting a PhD at Yale. So the beauty of jet travel and Zoom is very instrumental. As Dan Tadmore so gracefully gave us an excellent segue in the lunchtime discussion by talking about the power of art, in that case, to transmit October 7th impressions so quickly. That was my first thought, and in convening this particular session, we've had a lot of incredible people who are experts in statistics and numbers and political scientists and pollsters, but art and writing in general, writing from the heart, so not only fiction, but also what Josh has done, is really another entree. It's another way into these issues. So I wanted to first, by way of introduction, ask each of you to go along the row to tell us how your work explores the phenomenon of Israelis in America or Americans observing Israel, or both ways, and why did you choose this angle? And if you have a particular other writer or intellectual who is your inspiration, please add that also.
Should I go first? Okay. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Lauren, for making this conference happen. It's so great to be here in this wonderful company. So when you first sent us the questions or the talking points, I looked at it and what can I say? The answer is so obvious. How does my work explore the theme of Israelis in America? It's like asking, how does Moby Dick explore the theme of marine mammals? It's there. But then I thought about it, and I thought that I should, look inside and how I came to be an Israeli, a Hebrew writer living in America, and one that writes about Israeli expats, because these are two different things. And so, as you mentioned before, I was a linguist before I was a writer. I moved to England with my husband to do a PhD in linguistics. This was in the mid-1990s, a very hopeful time in Israel, right after the Oslo Accord. We thought this is going to be a new Middle East. We'll just get our PhDs, maybe a postdoc, and go back to Israel. Then things happened. Netanyahu happened for the first time. I can't begin to explain what it was for us back then. We felt that if a few months after Rabin was assassinated, this person was elected, something is broken and will not be easily fixed. And unfortunately, we were right. I'm sorry if I have to bring this into this room, but we have to talk about it. It's part of my path. And this is how we ended up in California after moving around for a few years. Around the same time, I realized that my academic career is not going to happen as expected. And on the other, part of the reason why it's not, because while I was supposed to be working on linguistics, I was writing my first novel. And then the novel came out, and all of a sudden, people who never even bothered to read any of my papers in linguistics read my book, and I thought, wow, this is actually so much better. So after a few years of moving back and forth, I'm now a full-time writer. I'm affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford. And my first book that I just mentioned, it touched on immigration. It was about a novel in verse about a Canadian Jewish young man who immigrates to Israel and the disappointment that he finds there. But later on, I mostly wrote about Israelis while living in America. And I remember it was around 2009 or 10 after my novel short story Master came out in Israel. And somebody who liked the book told me, wow, I would never imagine that you don't live in Israel. And I was thinking, is that a good thing? Is this a compliment? Do I want to keep on pretending that I live in Israel and write only about Israel? And at the same time, I was living in Silicon Valley. There were so many interesting people, Israeli expats that I met, so many stories worth telling. So I thought maybe there's, some other stories I should write about. And then the book that I wrote after that, in Hebrew, it's called Chashad Leshitayon, Suspected Dementia. It's about an elderly Israeli couple living in California. And ever since then, I've been moving back and forth. Some of my books take place in Israel, but mostly about Israeli expats. And I really feel it's part of my mission, part of it's not like I'm ideologically motivated. I always think about the book, what would make the best book. But I'm really glad that those stories that motivate me to write are also those that push the geographical envelope of Hebrew literature a little beyond the state of Israel.
Thank you. What brought me to write about Israelis living in America is sitting right next to me, my dear friend Maya Arad. And of all her wonderful books, actually the Hebrew Teacher, which is, everybody here should read it. It came out in English when, 2 years ago? Yeah. 2 years ago by the wonderful, New Vessel Press, and it's a really, really, I think, important book. And as a matter of fact, I never wrote about Israelis, and I often didn't even call myself an Israeli author. I called myself a Hebrew author, because the gravity center of my literary world is not necessarily Israel, Israeli society and all the issues that plague it and make it wonderful and make it terrible and everything that you've been hearing about in the last day and a half. Even when I lived in Jerusalem and wrote my first collection of short stories in Jerusalem, it was not an Israeli book. I'm going to make it a little more dramatic. I was uninterested in the drama of Israeliness, and then my other book that was like my big book so far and was translated to English, The Ruined House, was an exploration of America. I started writing it a year and a half, maybe or two, after I arrived in New York in the year 2000. And for me, this was my artistic literary response to the great discovery of America and American Jewry, which, like one of our very wise speakers today said, Israelis know very little about American Jewry, and there are reasons for that he already spoke about, so I'm not going to repeat. But so I was not very interested in Israel as a literary theme. And then I read the Hebrew Teacher, and I don't know why, because your other books also have Israelis in them, but this particular one, and that the novella, the Hebrew Teacher, in the center of the book, that's the center of the book, it kind of opened my eyes to seeing, oh, they are not transparent. The Israelis that live in America, they are no longer transparent for me. They are, and I was talking about them as they, because I wouldn't even think of myself as one of them. And then I said, wait, we are not transparent. So that was a moment. And then I wrote a new collection of short stories that came out in a very unfortunate timing of September 2023, a month before the sky fell on our head. That was mostly about Israelis living in America and the subtle, unspoken tragedy of people whose immigration is seemingly successful, and yet. So I honestly was not, it's a new discovery for me to write about Israelis.
First, I just want to say it's a huge honor to be on this panel with the titans of contemporary Hebrew literature. I am not one such person, and also not a novelist, maybe yet. So it's a little bit strange to be the kind of journalist, I guess, on the novelists panel. But I don't think that the craft of writing is necessarily so different. We can talk about the epistemology of journalism as we go on. But my first job, how did I end up writing about, I guess, Israelis and Americans and the politics of Israel-Palestine? The first job, first full-time journalism job that I held was for a publication in Israel, Palestine, called 972 Magazine, that has a Hebrew language side called Sicha Mekomit. And I think the nature of my job there in some ways encapsulated how I understood my role for most of my adult life, which is that this was my first job out of undergrad. And I had two tasks. One was to basically go out into the field and report on what was happening in Israeli politics. And that was, whether that was in what was happening at the time with Darfurian Eritrean refugees, whether that was what was happening in the in the occupied West Bank, whether that what was happening just in Israeli parliamentary politics. Because of my own autobiography, I was able to do that because I grew up in a Hebrew-speaking community. I lived in Israel for a time in my late teens, and so unlike some American Jews who don't grow up with Hebrew, and that's something we can also talk about, I was able to see a part of Israel that I think most of my peers in the communities that I grew up with would not have seen, which is the real Israel. Israel is a real country, as a flawed country, like, say, the United States. And So that was one thing that I was doing. The other thing that I was doing was translating. And that actually probably did more translating than reporting as per hours of taking the articles written in Hebrew on Sikha Mekomit and trying to translate them into idiomatic English. And for me, that was a deeply formative experience because it meant, as I understood my shlichut, my mission, in a sense, as a journalist and a political actor, was to translate the Israeli progressive camp into English. And the reason that felt like a urgent task was because most American liberals and progressives don't speak Hebrew, and at this point, most Israeli progressives and liberals don't speak the same English if they speak English. And I found that it wasn't an easy task to translate across those communities. When I came back from that time, that stint reporting in Israel, I discovered, or encountered rather, the challenge of trying to live in an American Jewish community that didn't want to hear about the things that I had seen and reported on. And in some ways, the book that I wrote, Tablet Shattered, which begins reporting on a protest in the West Bank during the time I was there, sort of charts my attempt to grapple with the shape of an American Jewish community that came to be unable to accept the political reality of what was happening in Israel, and then some of the consequences of that. It happened to be, and this is one of the perils of writing and trying to historicize in medias res, is that my own life happened to change, and a few things happened that changed some of the perspective. One is that I started writing a book when I was in my late 20s. I'm now 31. Over the course of that time, I got married, and I met my wife in Jerusalem. And we were always part of a kind of progressive, transnational community of both Anglos and Israelis who were doing, who were involved in the struggle for a democratic Israel. And so that, if for one part of my life, the Americanness had been, the emphasis, all of a sudden, the Israeli side began to gain in heft. And then the second event would be October 7th, when the progressive world that I had been a part of made it impossible to be there as a person who was basically a person of Israeli affinity, as I would put it, where the political, to use an academic term, the political subjectivity of me and my wife and our family was unacceptable among people who I had considered political allies. That's a rupture that I know I'm still confronting. It's not the reason why my wife and I live in Israel, but it certainly was a compelling force for us coming back. And the last thing I'll say about that is that people often ask me, how do you live in Israel right now in such a time? And the honest answer I have to tell them is that for me as a progressive and also as a journalist, but someone who has a certain value set, frankly, it's easier for me to live in Israel because I'm fighting basically a one-front battle rather than a two-front battle. And I don't have ambivalence when I go to, a protest, wherever it might be, and worry that there are people there who would seek to harm my loved ones. And I have found a community and, let's say, an esprit de corps of the desperate liberal camp. I work for Haaretz, and so it's not a battle that's going exceptionally well, but it is one that I feel equipped to fight much less ambivalently and much less complicatedly than I would be able to do in the States.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the first time I landed in Israel after October 7th. It was May of 2024, and I was visiting my daughter in Tel Aviv. And those of you who exist on college campuses know that that year was indescribable. on college campuses. And I realized I landed and we went to Kikar Dizengoff, where there was so much memorial, sort of really raw memorial, the stickers with the pictures of all of these young people and quotes and everything. And I realized in a very strange way, it was the first time that I was able to like just take a deep breath and know that everybody around me and that around that fountain was in various ways feeling the same way. And much as they disagreed on many things, that there was this sort of existential wishing that you didn't exist, that was the first time I had felt that way all year after being on a college campus in America. So along those lines, I'm wondering, since all of you have this transnational life, do you ever feel responsibility to present American Jews and/or Israel in a certain light? We heard from the museum professionals during the lunchtime session about the sometimes trickiness of, deciding how much of a possibly unflattering thing to reveal, for instance. Who's your audience? So I'm wondering, do you feel like you are some kind of representative, whether you chose that or not? And also, have you observed a difference in the way that your English language readers versus your Hebrew language readers react to your stories and your voice? So maybe we'll go in the same line.
So I think every choice we make as writers already has some consequences. So by the very fact that I write about Israeli expats, I make some choices about who I choose to represent, how I choose to represent them. And I go back in time some, 35, 40 years when I was growing up, when I became a reader of adult books. There were hardly any Israeli expats characters in Hebrew literature. If there were any, I can remember a few of them. They usually fell into several types. There were either greedy, they went to make a lot of money in America, or they lacked ideology, so they gave up life in Israel, or in some cases they would suffer from PTSD after the Yom Kippur War. I remember in particular Yitzhak Ben Ner has a story about one of these people. And luckily, both in life and in literature, the stigma on leaving Israel, on Yerida, is pretty much gone. And today there are quite a few writers, Hebrew writers, who write about life in America, Ruby and myself included, but also writers who actually live in Israel. Tehila Hakimi just published a book, Hunting in America, about a young woman who discovers hunting a culture in America. Ayelet Gundar Goshen, who spent some time in California, has this book, The Wolf Hunt, about an Israeli family in Palo Alto. I do feel that, I have a responsibility to represent my characters from within. So even though the stigma is gone, sometimes you feel, and maybe it's natural, because if the writer is just spending a few months in America, he or she look at the Israeli expat community from the outside. I'm really from within, I'm part of them. So I think my job is to describe them in a non-judgmental way, but really, as an observant participant of this community, which doesn't mean that my characters are perfect. They severely flawed, which I think makes for a better story, but that's what I see myself as doing. And by the way, I don't take it for granted for 1 minute that Israelis in Israel are willing to read about Israeli expats, because it hasn't always been the case. I think literature has caught up with reality, because living in America or in Europe, whether forever or for a few years, has become such a fundamental part of the Israeli experience. If you didn't go to graduate school in America, then maybe one of your siblings did, or one of your best friends. So people are eager to read about it, which I think is great. Now, regarding how people, different audiences react to my work, I already touched on it. Israelis in Israel are eager to read about Israeli expats, and I try to do my best, to represent them as part of this community. American Jews, now that two of my books are translated, so American Jews, I'm very glad, are eager to read about the Israeli community. Some of them told me, wow, there's this subgroup of American Jewry that I know next to nothing about, and they have their own characteristics, their own customs, and I'm glad I can read about them, and I'm very glad that, my book can do that. And then, regarding non-Jewish American readers, just these days, just writing about Israelis, as humans, not as monsters, is a political act. So I guess that's my job.
In general, I feel that once you, as an artist, as a writer, if you want to start representing, you're in trouble. Like that, I feel that the role, if there is a role, I believe art does have a role, but it's a much bigger role than representing this idea, that ideology, or this collective or that. I view my role as expanding the horizons of the literary imagination, of the Hebrew language, of language in general, of taking stories to their absolute horizon and then some. And in my particular case, also trying to live up to the great honor and privilege of being part of the Hebrew and Jewish literary tradition that I regard with the utmost, like for me, it's really sacred. So this is how I view, and as a matter of fact, when I write, I try hard, and sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder, not to imagine a reader at all, to forget that there's a reader in the room. And that's sometimes easier said than done, and in the good writing days, you forget that anyone is ever going to read this. You're just writing for yourself or for whatever it is that higher mind that may or may not read us one day. And these are the triumphant moments when I forget that there's world and there's representations and collective. Having said all this, when you stand and speak, you always find yourself, whether you want it or not, expected to speak about Israel and speak about American Jewry. And that, one does, because we are also people. We're not just writers. But I'm almost feeling that to be a good writer, I must divorce myself from this need to represent.
Yeah, that was very well put. I mean, I think in my role as a journalist, my primary obligation is to tell the truth. And that truth might be ugly, and it might be one that my nominal readers or audience don't want to hear. And that doesn't mean I shouldn't tell it to them or that I should sugarcoat it to them. And sometimes I think, and this will lead to my second, second guiding principle. I think in the American Jewish community in particular has let its muscle of self-criticism atrophy and does not often exhibit the capacity to be reflective about the consequences of its own commitments. And so if on the one hand, I have an obligation to tell the truth, I also have an obligation of a sort as a social critic. But being the role of a social critic, Michael Walzer, the political philosopher, famously coined the term the connected critic. And Walzer writes that critical distance is measured in inches. The connected critic stands a little to the side, but not outside. That's, a discretionary judgment about but I think it's something that we learn through being in like I have learned through being in relationship with the communities that I'm trying to speak to. And there have been times when I know that I've fallen outside of the community in such a way that they weren't able to hear what I was trying to say, even if I thought that I was, in some sense, delivering certain kinds of truths. And part of this is just, maturity and also going through some intense ideological or ideologically challenging moments. But the other part is just is learning how to be sensitive to the community's response to one's own criticism. You know, you'd mentioned there are models of people, and I actually think of two in mind. One is Irving Howe. I also worked at Dissent, and so part of my political education was gained through reading most of the archives of Dissent through like the 80s, basically. I would say it's got whatever, you can talk about what happened, and I think Irving managed to maintain his critical edge, his progressive politics, and also his attachment to, let's say, Klal Yisrael, and Yiddishkeit, which is important to me in my life. And then on the Israeli politics side, I often think of, I mean, he wrote also in English, but Avishai Margalit, whose essays for the New York Review of Books in particular are penetrating and are exemplars of a kind of engaged, scholarly journalism that doesn't shy away from confronting its audiences with hard truths, but is never condemning them to their enemies, I guess, is how I would put it.
So Irving Howe is a good segue because he also was ostracized by the rise of the New Left, and partly because he refused to reject his connection with Yiddishkeit and with really, the Jewish soul, and with Israel for that matter. So I'm going to start going in the opposite direction here, try for equity, balance. My next question actually directly, I know, has affected you in your life, Josh. How have recent boycotts or actions against Israeli authors or themes affected you? And I know this landed you on the front pages of some Jewish publications a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's actually basically exactly a year ago. I imagine that a large portion of the people who have heard of the book that I wrote at all heard about it because I was supposed to have an event with the Reform Rabbi Andy Bachman in Brooklyn, and at the last minute, the bookstore decided that they couldn't have the event because he is a Zionist. But I will just say that there are probably other reasons for this, but I have not held an event for my book in a bookstore in the United States. I've not been able to find a venue that would host a discussion of this book. That's not, I don't think, only because of Israel politics. That's because it's a book about Jewish identity. And we heard from Josh Cohen last night. Josh, who's a friend, and I have been having a conversation ongoing over the last, year, basically, about how, and this is also something that Frank Foer, who spoke last night too, wrote in his own way in his piece for The Atlantic. There was a time when the American Jewish story was considered to be a representative story that Americans who were not Jewish were imagined to be able to connect to. That period, for many reasons, is over. And so the people who are reading books about Jews are Jews almost exclusively. That wasn't always the case. Non-Jews read Philip Roth, presumably. Interesting to think about what has happened to Philip Roth's own legacy. I mean, we could talk about the fact that he's probably not taught in most American literature classes today on college campuses. And not because of his Jewishness necessarily, but for other reasons too. So he may be a bad example in some sense, but I think it's symptomatic of a broader front. So all of which is to say, I think I don't want to minimize the for lack of a better word, assault on freedom of expression that is happening to people who are presumed to have any connection to Israel. But I also think that it's happening, and it's both caused by similar factors but also independent of this other thing that's happening, which is that the American Jewish story, That's why the subtitle of my book is The End of an American Jewish Century, what we know of as the American Jewish experience, the institutions that shaped it throughout the 20th century, what we think of as American Jewish culture was formed in a very particular time period, and that time period has ended. And the universal significance of the Jewish story is not seen to be universal anymore. And that's part of, I think, what we're seeing.
Ruby, do you want
So I find that I created my life in a relatively small bubble of Jewy Jews in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So there was
you could do worse.
so clearly it was a safe space after October 7th. However, as I mentioned, there was an unfortunate collection of short stories called Big Fish that was never translated to English. And so, I mean, the way to go around it was like, short stories are not such hot merchandise in the publishing world today, nor in Israel and not here. So it may have saved the publishers the need to say, and also this may not be the best time for Israeli fiction at this moment. So I can't say that I personally felt the brunt of it, but I know many people that did. I know people in the world of visual arts. I know people in theater and in film. Things were canceled, works were sent back. Galleries decided that this may not be the greatest time to present Israeli art, and also I have good friends, very close friends, who were heads of serious organizations in the field of culture and who suffered greatly. One of them even lost her job in an organization that she brought to life and made amazing because she wouldn't join the mob. And she was very liberal, very progressive, just she wouldn't present them with that particular pound of flesh that they demanded. So yes, it is there. It is definitely there.
My first book in translation came out a few months after October 7th, so I don't have anything to compare this with. It's not like I had two before and two after, and I can tell you, okay, there's a... So that's the only reality I know. So I really can't tell. My hunch is that, yes, there is some effect, but going back to what Ruby and Josh talked about before, I think, boycott is minuscule compared to, people not reading as much as they used to. And if I had to put it into a slogan, my enemy is not BDS, it's Instagram. I'm serious.
I agree.
Having said all that, so I can say, yes, it was challenging to find a bookstore that would host an event for my book. My publisher actually contacted some stores that he had great events at in September, and they said, oh, yeah, absolutely, we'd love to. Call us back in January. In January, they were mysteriously booked up. But we did find a place. It was Shakespeare and Company in the Upper West Side. It was great, and Joshua Cohen, our mutual friend, was in conversation with me, and we were quite worried because this was April 2024 when, campuses were on fire, and we knew people from the arts and from, filmmakers who were heckled and, very unpleasant experiences. So we were preparing ourselves, and then we found out that nobody cares about literature. Nobody came to to heckle us, which was a relief, but also, it was sad.
Much to Josh's disappointment, I think.
Yeah, but again, Ruby, Josh, and I were riding the train yesterday in the afternoon to come here, and we talked about, people don't read as much as they did, and there are not that many reviews for new books as they used to. So we can't really tease this apart.
And you also, one of the times that we've spoken, you talked about the particular predicament of female novelists and what I think maybe Jessica said to you about, your translator, about what it takes to get translated.
Right. So yes, it took me more than 20 years from the day I published my first book until my first book was translated. I had a lovely neighbor back at Stanford, a Jewish woman in her 90s. Every time she would see me, she said, "I want to read you before I die." And at some point, I told her, "You have to learn Hebrew." It's not happening. So yes, so it's never easy for anyone, but Jessica Cohen, the wonderful translator who translated this book into English, she has a theory that, the American market, when they translate someone they want from a foreign language, they want something extra. We have enough English novels about midlife crisis, about marital trouble, And what do you want from Hebrew literature? The IDF, Holocaust, kibbutz, stuff like that, and Mossad, Shoah, Tzava, Mossad, that's the Trinity. And since men tend to write about those topics more than women, often they get translated more often. I think she's right about that.
And also, Ruby, remembering an earlier conversation we had, I think it's relevant for you to explain to me what happened with the Sapir Prize after you had, because it's the other side also. It's not only BDS, enemies of Israel. It's also there are things impinging on writers from the other side.
I mean, today a few of the speakers spoke about, we're kvetching and lamenting what's happening in America, and at the same time, there's something that in Israel that contracts and becomes closed and clenched and hostile towards the world. Toxic local patriotism, chauvinism, very strong, getting worse and worse. And my taste of it was in the year, it's almost 10 years ago, wow.
More than 10 years.
When was it? January, משהו כזה.
Almost 11.
Yeah, almost 11. So when, after the Ruined House won the Sapir Prize in Israel, a few months later, first of all, people told me even then, don't expect to get the prize because they will never dare. They'll come under fire, they're endorsing. If they'll give you the prize, it'll seem like they're endorsing the brain drain, people leaving Israel. They would not, why do they need this headache? There are plenty of good writers in Israel. So thankfully, that was refuted. And a few months of quiet after the winning, so that was nice. And then I woke up early one day to see a whole flurry of messages on my phone. What do you have to say from journalists, people I've never spoken to? And I said, what? I didn't know it. It was 7 o'clock. And they apparently did a very dramatic, and in Israel, it is very personal and not very subtle. A very dramatic change to the guidelines of the leading literary prize, closing it to anyone who does not live in Israel. And of course, Maya is the first casualty because everybody spoke about Maya as like a leading candidate for the next year. And I think she should have been. And this was, it was not only this unpleasant moment, but it was also a turning point, I feel, where the Israeli culture too is closing up against the world, against the Israeli diaspora in the world, unless they can use us, and between us against American Jewry.
If I can just add to that,
Please.
Obviously it stung, and I felt terrible for Ruby because he was such a deserving candidate and he got all the fire. But at the same time, it had a feeling of empowerment because until then, no one acknowledged that there are really good novelists who don't live in Israel. And all of a sudden, there are so many of us and we're so good that we're a real threat. So
We were imposing a danger suddenly.
yeah.
I'm wondering, Josh, if you have any similar experience.
Well, I could say, since we are talking about the relationship, I can maybe talk about the other direction, which is that, so when I had a few meetings after my book came out in English to see, there were a few languages that I knew I wanted it to be published in, one of which is Hebrew, and the other is French. For reasons that I think I have some tangential relation to the French Jewish community, and I care a great deal about what's happening there as well. So my first meetings with people in Israel, it became very clear to me that a book about the American Jewish experience in Hebrew was going to be a no-go. As they told me, they said, you could translate this on your own by yourself and see what happens, or you could find a donor who would basically foot the bill for you to do it, but there's no publishing house that would agree to do this of their on their own, because there's really no audience for a book like this. The only language to date that my book has been translated to is Chinese. But I think that, just to add to something that Ruby was saying,
That's a large market to buy,
yeah,
buy copies,
well,
so
yeah.
you're going to choose one.
But I think that it is true that we I think we've spoken a lot at this conference about the limits or the boundaries on expression here, but they are quite substantial in Israel as well. I mean, another figure who I also admire, who I think about in this context, is the sociologist Eva Illouz, who on the one hand is fighting an incredible war against extremism on the left in France, and has written an amazing pamphlet called The 8th of October that I hope it will be translated into English, because I think it captures in great detail and psychological depth some of the pathologies of the contemporary so-called left. And then she was slated to win the highest prize in Israel, an academic prize in Israel, for her work in sociology. And Miki Zohar is the Minister of Education. It was Kish, Yoav Kish. It's hard for me to tell them apart sometimes. Said nope, and they stripped her of her award. And so you have someone who is, on the one hand, BDS in every single part of Western Europe and the United States for being a Zionist, and denied a Lifetime Achievement Award for being probably one of the most important sociologists of the second half of the 20th century in the country where she's made her home in Israel. And I think that double bind is really the double bind that Israeli progressives of Israeli affinity outside of Israel are facing at this really difficult time.
Oh, that's really intense. Before we get to audience questions, I have one more question for each of you, which is, what's your next project in the works? Josh, I know what you're working on, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So in my other hat, I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Yale working on modern Jewish history and modern intellectual history, and hopefully this will be the second book, but it's about how U.S. policymakers, and also to a certain extent European policymakers, came to see anti-Semitism as a diagnostic indicator of democratic decline in the late 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union and the democratic transition in Eastern Europe. And hopefully I'll be able to trace an intellectual genealogy of how people came to believe anti-Semitism could serve that purpose.
And after October 7th, for the first time in my life, I wrote a ton about Hamatzav, about politics and what's happening. And so then after I spending almost a year doing things I've never done, finally I could sit down and start a new novel. I cannot, as I just told my friend Michael, I cannot speak a lot about it, but it has something to do with the Hasidic movement in the 19th century. So not here, not in Israel, not now, pure escapism.
And I'm working on my next novel, and I can say even less than Ruby because it's really brand new, but it takes place in America, and it's not about October 7, but it's about the post-October 7 reality that we all live in.
Thank you. Do we have questions? We have microphones waiting. Questions? Yes, we have. Oh, okay.
Good. Is this on?
Yes.
So I have a question for Josh. In the beginning, you said, I think you were talking about people who in Israel, and you said if they spoke English, they spoke a different kind of English, or words to that effect. I wonder if you could amplify what you meant by a different kind of English, and one or two examples of how that might be significant.
That's a great question. So, I mean, I think what I meant is two things. Well, I was speaking mainly about the Israeli progressive camp and the different way that they speak about politics than their American counterparts. Now, one instance is that American liberals, generally speaking, and Jewish liberals among them, are not, or have not until maybe recently, been critics of identity politics. In fact, I think to this day, American Jews haven't figured out what they want from identity politics. And sometimes I think American Jews want it both ways. They want no DEI, but DEI for Jews. And I think that that's a profoundly inconsistent position, and one that's transparently cynical and wrong. I also think, and here's another example, I think that American Jews for the most part, don't have a coherent concept of Jewish collectivity, which is something that Israeli Jews take for granted, that Jews are a nation, which is a sentence that if you say it in some parts of the liberal Jewish world, people are uncomfortable with. So those are maybe the two biggest ones. On the other hand, Israeli progressives are profoundly secular and have are deeply uncomfortable with religious language, which for most of the second half of the 20th century has actually been the primary language of American Jewish liberal activist politics, which causes some translation difficulties as well.
Okay. We have a question back there. Professor Brenner?
Just, first of all, thank you. Wonderful panel, another wonderful panel. I couldn't help but think a little bit. Does that work? Think a little bit about another Hebrew writing Jewish diaspora, which I covered a little bit in my research. It was the 1920s, Berlin. Or not just Berlin, Germany. I mean, Agnon. Actually, all the most important Hebrew writers lived in Germany at some point. Agnon for 12 years and had his house not burned down. He probably might not have ever left. Bialik, that lived there, and his 50th birthday was a huge celebration in Berlin Philharmonic. And then all of those who we only remember because they have street names in Israel, Frischman and Berdichevsky and many others. And today, again, there is a Hebrew writing, smaller community in Berlin. Actually, I just learned from Maya, even a publishing house, publishing in, I think, 3 languages in Berlin now. Josh mentioned France is another important center. My question is, do you connect in any way? Do you see, is there a new Hebrew-speaking diaspora more than just in America? Are there any connections, either with the past and more with the present today?
We will both answer, I think. So, whatever you prefer. I can.
So, of course, I'm aware of the Hebrew writers in Berlin, in London too. Brenner was in London and other places. But I think Ruby and I grew up within, Hebrew literature from Israel. Starting 1948, Hebrew literature was almost exclusively concentrated in Israel, unfortunately. Of course, I feel I'm a very good friend of Ruby's, and I feel a deep affinity with Hebrew writers abroad, wherever they are. But as I mentioned before, my path was very windy, and I ended up in America. I didn't go to Berlin to become a diasporic Hebrew writer like some writers recently did. I just ended up, in America, and Hebrew is the only language I have. So I feel both, connected and also, like my own special case. Regarding the future of this diaspora, looking at my own two daughters and the children of my friends, I think the only way to keep it is if more and more Israelis will move abroad, because our children will not write in Hebrew. I can say, but by the time I was sad that my daughters will not read any Hebrew book for pleasure, I missed the train and they're just not reading for pleasure. I'm sorry, it's my hobby horse, but yes, people don't read, and the younger generation, yeah, I'm going back to it all the time.
Yeah. There's a comfort in being we're a vanishing medium. There's something liberating about it. We don't have to worry about the future. We both know and are very friendly with the entire Hebrew literary diaspora, all 5 of them, great people, wonderful. I think the difference between, at least myself, I'm not going to speak for Maya, and this group of Israeli intellectuals, and I use the word Israeli, even though they were Hebrew, were not Israeli, but I think it's Israeli. Intellectuals, writers, artists that live in Berlin, is that there's a certain, a strong sentiment that they express of disappointment with Zionism, a certain post-Zionist element that I do not share. I'm not. And there's also a big argument, which of course in our very, very small world is a big argument. We're just in that famous train ride with Josh Cohen, Maya, and myself yesterday from Washington. We discussed the latest article that was published in Haaretz 2 days ago, where a local Israeli poet and editor trashes Alt-Neuland Press and says, it's just nonsense, it's a fad, it's never going to happen. So there's a big argument amongst the Israeli literary diaspora, again, all 5, 6, 7 of us, that whether there's really a diaspora, a Hebrew diaspora, or are we basically Israeli expats living off of the Israeli literary world, writing for it, using its platform. And I am of the disappointing opinion that we are. I don't believe that there's going to be a giant, vibrant a Hebrew world divorced from Israel, divorced from Zionism, that's going to thrive, create, have readers, have writers. It's not going to happen. So that's where I stand.
It might for a generation or two, like the Yiddish literature.
I was just going to say, just to inject a slightly optimistic note. It's possible, we can't know, but it's possible that something could be created that is very, very different. But I'm sitting here thinking about, you sound so sad, and it reminds me of this poem by, I think it's by Leilis, the Yiddish poet Leilis, who has this poem entitled Yiddish Poets. And in it, there's a line that says something like, "We drag our poems through the streets like they're dead cats." And he's writing this in the 20s or 30s in New York. And, we know that the majority of Hitler's victims were Yiddish speakers. And so people wrote the obituary way before. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, there is a revival, and thousands of people, young people, non-Haredi people, of course, the Haredi world, yes, Yiddish has been alive and well for a long time, are learning Yiddish in universities and through music, and they're going to Yiddish cultural weeks, and they're writing, and there are literary journals across the world and programs that it's growing. So you never know.
Right. When you mentioned a poem, I thought you were talking about Lemi Ani Amel by Yalag, where he laments, who am I working for? Nobody reads. There are so few Hebrew readers, and actually, I'm sorry if I sound sad, I'm not. I'm just a really realistic, but there are so many more Hebrew readers today than there were 150 years ago when he wrote his poem, so that's a reason to be
Yeah.
happy. That's a victory of Zionism, as Ruby likes to say.
But I just, if I may, and then I'm sorry, I just have to say that without sounding judgmental, I feel that Hebrew was a failure in America in general. The project of Hebrew, even during that famous golden era, imagined or real, Hebrew fell between the cracks. People were desperate for their kids to learn Spanish, and they were wanted the fancier wanted French, and then the opportunistic wanted them to learn Mandarin, but very few actually made a priority of really learning Hebrew, and let alone now when it's so fraught, the association.
Yeah, I'll just jump on the kind of melancholic and pessimistic train here and say two things. Yeah, what can we do? It's the disposition. I would be astonished if a modern novel came out of the secular contemporary Yiddish revival scene. I don't think that the people learning that language can ever write in prose at the level of the great works. There are people, and this is something that I think is more interesting, and now I can put on my other hat as someone who has some personal proximity to the Haredi world, is that it's much more likely that people speaking Hasidic Yiddish, maybe American Yiddish, produce a strange, weird form of literary production that approximates a kind of picaresque novel. My sense is that that is actually already happening behind the scenes, because there are a lot of the Haredi Yiddish-speaking world is now large enough that there are nonconformists who are experimenting with these sorts of things. And if there is one segment of global Jewish society that only has books, it's the Haredi world. And if you walk into a toy store in a Haredi neighborhood, you will find the most amazing thing: young children fighting with each other over who gets to get what book. Not something you see, let's say, in Manhattan too often. But I think that I think that now, to put on the maybe historian and critic hat, American Judaism as a diaspora is perhaps unique among the great diasporas in that it produced I would argue, and this is an argument, that it did not produce a language of its own or a true synthetic culture of its own. That the great European diaspora produced Yiddish, there was Ladino, Judeo-Arabic. American Jews will not leave a distinctive cultural marker on the Jewish bookshelf. They have left one on the American bookshelf in the form of the narrative that Saul Bellow and Roth and all these people, which is basically a narrative of from the shtetl to the world, or from the ethnic neighborhood to the world. And that was significant for the story of American assimilation. But I don't think that, not in theology, not in literature, will there be an enduring work comparable to some of the great diasporas of Jewish history coming out of America.
Very provocative. Oh, yes. Right. Yes, it's a formative book. And for those who couldn't hear, Tilly Olson, yes, also one of my inspirations. She was born in Nebraska, by the way. Weird thing about her.
How did you get the last name Olson?
Yeah, it was her married name. So we have time for one or two more questions. Oh, Ben, yes.
Is this working? Okay. I was wondering, from a literary perspective, and professions that are all about communicating tough topics, how do we encourage dialogue between the many microcosms of the Jewish-Israeli communities around the world? And how can we expand that forward outside of just those communities? How do we get people to go to these book signings? How do we get bookstores to host them? How do we get Israelis and Israeli Americans and Jewish Americans and Jews all around the world talking with each other about something that they will almost assuredly disagree on? And how do we as individuals within those microcosms communicate out those tough topics? Easy question.
Yeah. All eyes are on you, Josh. All eyes.
You have the
all
mic,
eyes
so
on
you have to
Leifer.
take it.
We spoke about dialogue yesterday at dinner too, and I said that I feel dialogue is a very unpopular medium nowadays. I don't feel we live in a dialogical era. I feel that it's we walk around and there's a lot of full volume, heightened monologues bombarding us from every direction. And I'm not sure that literature and art are necessarily also dialogical. I mean, there's something about actually, if you take the medium of a novel or a literature and you go with it, there is this monological element to it. You have to make your voice very clear, very strong, unique and compelling. Maybe if you do it well enough, maybe it will break through this noise that we're all living with, and people will be forced to want to speak to you. Because I don't know how to go now and try to convince people on the right, on the left, on this generation, that generation, to go back to this idea or fantasy of a civilized dialogue like the one I was raised with. I don't know if we could go back to it. So maybe we just have to perfect our voice and be more of who we are, and hopefully we'll be attractive enough.
I don't know how to answer your question generally. I can just share one experience that I had. When the Hebrew teacher came out, I presented my book at Fordham University, and someone raised their hand. She was not a teenager. She was a professor in her 60s. And then she said, before I ask my question, I want to state that I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. And then she asked her question, and I was there. I didn't quite know what to do with it. And I thought, maybe she's an anti-Zionist Jew, but she had enough willingness to come to my talk and to listen. And I tried to see her point of view. And then I said, well, before I answer your question, let me tell you that I congratulate you that your family made it safely to America. My paternal grandparents tried very, very hard to come to America. They couldn't because after 1924, immigration restrictions and so on. So they went for Plan B without really wanting to, which Plan B was a certificate of immigration to mandatory Palestine. And we all know what happened to those who didn't even get Plan B. And I told her, maybe if my family made it to America, I would be here instead of you, because I try to be in her skin. And I would be here and I would say, yes, I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, but being who I am and with my history, it's not happening. And I could see that she understood. Of course, not everybody would understand. People need to have some kind of a willingness to even listen to you. Sometimes it just won't work. But in this particular case, I felt that I kind of detonated the explosive statement, and I was willing to see where she was coming from, and she was willing to see where I was coming from. And after my talk, she came to me and she told me that she went to Israel as a teenager, and she felt a lot of condescending attitude from Israelis her age, and I remember that. I remember how. Did you ever feel that?
I'm laughing.
I think Lauren was the most popular. Come on.
No, just as Israelis can be very condescending. So I think it's all about listening to the other person's concerns and trying to.
I'm biting my tongue. I'm a Jersey girl, so you're going to get sarcasm if I respond to that. Yes, Josh, last word, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have better advice than these for dialogue across difference. I'll say two things. I mean, one was that the book that I wrote was in its own way an attempt at an intergenerational dialogue. In some ways, it started out to tell the story of young Jews who had grown disillusioned with the contemporary state of Israel. And in the end, it ended up explaining those Jews to their parents, who were the ones willing to pick up the book, but not the kids themselves. And that has been an interesting place for me to be in because I have tried to, through the book and through speaking to Jewish audiences, bring the different generations closer to understanding. If I'm being honest, it's not been very successful in the sense that I think the parents are more willing, are more willing to read the book than the children, some of whom are actually like reported on and interviewed in it. You know, I think that literary culture beyond politics is under tremendous threat by technology, by the culture of contemporary media, which turns everything into television and kind of enthrallment to the image. And I don't really have a lot of optimism that like what we're doing is going to be super relevant to large numbers of people. And in the future, I mean, let's be honest, it already is not relevant to large numbers of people in the future. Like if you look up how many copies books sell, including books that like won prestigious awards, and it's tough out there. And I think that we all, as writers, live with that reality, like with that recognition that some of us may, you know, at one point have dreamed of speaking to a wider range of people, but the circle of readers is actually quite small. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. In some ways, you know, we in Judaism, you know, there's the concept of the surviving remnant. And I think that, you know, in some ways we're approaching that level of literary culture where the people who continue to read and continue value books will somehow kind of be like a wreckage from a previous century.
Of course, there are book groups now, which is, you know, enjoy great popularity. We need a Jewish Oprah, actually, to inject some interest. I mean, I'm not kidding. There are many books that really, you know, achieved new life through the sort of popularization of.
I'll just say, like, it's a crazy stat, but in order to get at the bottom rung of the New York Times bestseller list, you only need to sell, and sometimes it's less than this, in a week, 2,000 books. That's it.
Good to remember. Wow, thank you so much. It's really been an honor.